And yes, there are two exceptions. I won't get into that this moment. But marriage creates this new loyalty that's to be indivisible. And loyalty to your spouse means that you look out for the best interest even before your other family, because they became your other family. Your family is now you and your sweetie pie and the kids that come out of it. The old family, they become the other family. It's not that you don't love them. It's not that you don't even love them with the same love you always have. And it's not that you're not loyal to them at all. That is not it. As a matter of fact, the Bible tells you to honor your mother and your father. That honor extends beyond my marriage covenant, okay? I am to honor my family, my mother and father. But my loyalty first is to my spouse. Even if my spouse is a jerk. And that does nothing about my spouse here. I'm just giving this for you, okay? I'm saying that because we all think that at some point. We all think that. And your spouse can be a real jerk, can't they? My wife's spouse can be a real jerk. Believe me, we all can be. But I'm still to be loyal to her. And men, I'm sorry, but it's time to quit being mama's boy and to let mama wean the baby, isn't it? It's time to be weaned from mama's ninny. That's the truth. You know? It's time. I'll just leave it at that. I love my mom, and I don't want to talk too much about me, okay? But I understand that real closeness of relationship that happens. But gentlemen, your wife is not your mom. And women, your man, your husband is not your daddy. No, it's your husband. There's a different kind of relationship there. And yeah, you might find some similarities between your husband and your dad or between your mom and your wife, but it's a different relationship. And so the word here for join says what God has joined together. Check this out. It has the idea of being glued together. It's the idea of being two people being glued together. And whatever you do to your spouse, think about this. You're glued with her. So or with him. And so if you're glued together and you're just beating on each other, do you think you're not going to feel the effects of that? If I'm beating, the Bible says that we become one flesh. I'm hurting myself. By beating on my spouse. By saying hurtful things. Oh, but it feels good for the moment. Oh, but boy, the consequences hurt even me, hurt my kids, that hurt society. You see, whatever you do to your spouse will have enormous consequences on you and those around you because you are glued together. Can Siamese twins go apart from each other? Imagine that. A Siamese twins going out and, one robs a bank and the other one says, I'm innocent, I ain't going to jail. Oh, yes, he is. He or she is, right? There's no way to get around that one. I don't care if your brother or sister robbed a bank. You're attached. You're glued together. And then Jesus says in verse 8, he says, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. See, because marriage creates a new entity that is to be indivisible. Marriage creates a new loyalty. Marriage creates, and it creates a new entity. That's like saying there's this new legal contract. Yes, it's created by it, correct? There's this league. They become one flesh legally, spiritually, and physically. Now, I think most of us, when we read this, when we say that the two become one flesh, we probably think about the intimacy side of it, the physical aspects of that, correct? And there is a physical aspect there because they do become one flesh physically. And it's in more ways than one. It's not just the act of affirming the marriage on your honeymoon night, which I hope you waited for. But it is that. There is that side of one flesh of intimacy on the physical level, correct? But there's also another physical union that comes out of it, and that is children. Children are the product of physical intimacy of two people who have come together. And that person takes on the DNA and the genetic code of both the mother and the father. And you literally have a representation of those two people in one person. So much that it drives some of you mad because they remind you so much of your spouse. Or they remind you of you and it drives you mad. Then two become flesh physically, they become one flesh spiritually. Become one flesh spiritually. Matter of fact, Paul says in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32, he says that this is a great mystery. But I speak concerning Christ and the church, and what he's talking about is husbands and wives being together. He quotes the same verse that Jesus does. Let me back up to Ephesians 5:28. He says, so husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body and flesh of his bones. Verse 31, he quotes the same verse as Jesus. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And then he says, this is a great mystery. What's so mysterious about it? Well, because there's also a spiritual union made. You realize there's a spiritual union made between you and every person that you have physical intimacy with? You have created a spiritual union there. You've created a spiritual union. As a matter of fact, 1 Corinthians 6:16, Paul says, do you not realize that when a man joins himself to a prostitute, he makes with her a physical unity? For God says the two shall become flesh. That's why they say that you're sleeping with everyone that they ever slept with. There's a spiritual unity that happens there, my friends. Physical intimacy is not just, it's not just a biological act. It is very much ought to be a spiritual act, and it is, whether you treat it that way or not. That's why it ought to be reserved simply for one man and one woman. But marriage also creates this entity that's indivisible because the two also become one flesh legally. Legally. This is part of the problem with people living together today, isn't it? Living together is because they don't recognize the legal ramifications of following through with that commitment of being with that person for one person for the rest of your life. And you know what? Marriage is not a private matter. I'm tired of hearing that argument by our society too, that marriage is private. What happens in the bedroom doesn't affect anybody else but them. That is not true, and that is hogwash. If it affects them, it will affect society. It will affect their attitudes. If it affects them, it affects the rest of society. You say, well, it's just between them and them. Oh, yeah? Well, do you think that if a man is being satisfied by a mistress, do you think he just very well might not be likely to go home and neglect his wife? Or vice versa? Do you think if a man or a woman is looking at pornography on the internet and indulging in these kind of activities and looking at child porn and just degrading further and further, do you think he's not as likely to be involved in child molestation? Hello? Don't tell me that what happens in your bedroom doesn't affect society. Yes, it does. Now, we may hope that they never find out about it, and we'll hope that you can contain it, but it does affect, and that's why marriage is a legal entity to protect not just you, not just your spouse, and the kids that come from you two, but it also is designed to protect the rest of society. Now, one of the biggest reasons I hear, one of the biggest arguments for same-sex marriage is that, divorce rates are so high, you don't respect marriage anyways, you heterosexual married people. I mean, 50% of you are going to get divorced. Who are you?